Welcome to Ship It, a podcast about ops, infrastructure, and swag. I'm your host, Gerhard Lazu, and this is the post-KubeCon Cloud Native Con EU 2022 episode. We are talking to Matt Moore, founder and CTO of Chainguard, about all things Knative and Sigstore. The most important topic, however, is swag, because no one does stickers and t-shirts better than Chainguard. The other topic is the equivalent of Let's Encrypt for securing software. Speaking of security, we currently protect our static and app origins by putting Fastly in front. One of the benefits is minimal latency for all our users, regardless where they are in the world. Learn more at fastly.com.
This episode is brought to you by Qt, a new platform that brings fully managed Argo CD and enterprise services to the cloud or on-premise. The platform is a versatile Kubernetes operator for handling cluster deployments the GitOps way. And I'm here with Kelsey Hightower, angel investor and advisor to Acuity. Kelsey, why are you excited about Argo CD and what's happening here with Acuity?
When I think about Argo CD, it represents the transition from traditional CI/CD. You have the big server with a built-in workflow engine. And you could only do what that system can do, whether it's Jenkins, whether it's Spinnaker, you name it. Those things tend to be all-in solutions, and they're all predicated on having their own built-in workflows, UIs, and ways of doing things. And then when I think about kind of the Argo CD, that whole open source movement kind of backed by the ideas we saw in the Kubernetes world, which was each of those steps is nothing more than just a step in a workflow. And after 10, 20 years of doing CI/CD, how best to represent those steps? And it turns out this whole container thing is probably the best way to have little snippets of logic sit at each of those steps in the workflow, and then you can kind of exchange them and share them to build any pipeline you want. So the way to look at this is Kubernetes has never had a workflow engine or tool. And so when you think about kind of Argo workflow or Argo CD, which is kind of a specialized workflow, kind of attacking the how do you roll out software problem, that's the way I would think about it. So if you're all in on Kube and you like the Kubernetes ecosystem, then you kind of have a choice of workload types. And I would probably just say it's another workload type you can put in your toolbox. So if you got something that can benefit from a workflow engine and reuse the logic that you already have in containers, it kind of feels like the perfect fit.
The perfect fit. All right. Thanks, Kelsey. Well, the next step is to head to acuity.io/changelog. They are inviting all of our listeners to join the closed beta. Again, acuity.io/changelog. Links are in the show notes.
We are going to ship in 3, 2, 1.
First of all, hi Matt. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I have noticed from your Twitter profile that you are in the business of shipping chains. How's that business coming along these days?
Well, we're pivoting away from swag. I'm wearing, all my Chainguard stuff, and we've got stickers and stuff too, including my face. Thanks to Scott for those.
That's an amazing one. Okay, do you have one with Dan with lots of hair? Do you have such a sticker? That's the one that I want.
Actually, we have one of just the hair somewhere. I think it may be in my closet. But
okay.
Yeah, there are pictures of it online, I think. But it's basically a halo of hair that you can use to attach to other stickers to sort of Danify them. I think Scott even made 2 sizes of them so you can, have the sort of multi-level halo effect. Paul Morey and Dan Pop had sort of a field day with on Twitter, making him have this enormous lion's mane of hair. But yeah, Scott is our sort of swag master and has been refining his art. And, it's great. He did it for a few years for Knative related swag and, has carried that over to Chainguard swag and has just been killing it. So
I have to talk to him about some tips seriously, because he's, as you mentioned, really killing it. And I'm somewhat disappointed that you're pivoting from the swag business, because I thought you're doing really, really well. And you're doing so well that one of the main reasons for me coming in person to this KubeCon is to get some of that swag. I've been waiting years for this. So please have at least 2 of each for me, because I'm like, first thing when I arrive, I come to the Chainguard booth and I look for the swag. So by the way, where is the Chainguard booth? Can you tell me?
So we don't yet have a booth this KubeCon, unfortunately, but we will be around, and I think we'll have a few options swag-wise. I'm not sure we're toting. So last time we both, let's see, Scott, Vile, and I all checked a giant box of T-shirts, and then we carried them around all of KubeCon. I don't think we're bringing huge amounts of shirts across the Atlantic, but I think we're going to have a form folks can, submit to get swag sent to them, which will make it easier for them to get it where they are as well. And I think Scott's has all manner of stickers that we will be handing out. There's, the octopus and a bunch of costumes, probably my face, although there's a few of us. Scott has one of his face and Vile's face too. I think there may be one specific to Valencia, although I'm not sure he's turning it into a sticker. He's definitely got the image. He's always got something cooking, so I'm sure there will be some fun swag surprises from him.
So I'm really looking forward to putting that link to the form in the show notes. I think people will love it, especially since this is coming out the week after the KubeCon. I think they will really appreciate it. We already established that the thing that I'm most looking forward to this KubeCon is the Chainguard swag. So that was already established. But I'm wondering, what are you most looking forward to at this KubeCon in EU?
That's a great question. So I think there's a few answers to it. I think personally, one of the things that I'm most excited about is this is the first KubeCon ever where Knative is going to be in the CNCF. And, as you know, Knative's near and dear to me. And so there will be like whole Knative Con Day 0, whatever it's called now. Since there's 2 days. So I think that's one piece of it. But, I love the sort of hallway track connecting with people. And there was KubeCon in LA, but when that happened, it was still virtually impossible for folks in the EU to travel because of the state the pandemic was in. And so, there's loads of people that we collaborated with in the context of Knative and other projects that, I haven't seen in years. And especially the folks that are EU based, you just see them less often, I think. So just, reconnecting with the people, since I feel like open source is all about the people.
What is the first thing that you're going to do when you arrive in Valencia? Have you thought about it?
That's a good question. Well, probably check into my Airbnb or wherever I'm staying. I think I'm staying with Scott and Vile, so it should be a very interesting week. But after that, I'm excited to go back to Spain because the food when we were in Barcelona was very good. And I still think about, the paella and the pulpo and stuff like that we had that week, which were just great. Probably ate way more rice than I should have that week in paella form, but it was fantastic. So looking forward to some of the delicious Spanish foods, but starting to connect with people is, after that.
I do have to say that's something which I'm most looking forward to. This is my first KubeCon EU in person. I've never been to KubeCon EU in person. My previous one was obviously virtual. And I think two KubeCon EUs ago is also virtual. But that was like a bit even more different because I think it was like the first year was like, everything was just being figured out. That was a huge adjustment, 2020. KubeCon North America 2019. That was my first and last in-person KubeCon. So this is a big one for me.
Was that San Diego?
That was San Diego. Yes, it was. Yes. That was a good one. I really enjoyed myself. Yeah. So yeah, really looking forward to that. I know that there are a couple of Chainguard talks at this KubeCon, 5+1. 5 at KubeCon and 1 in the Reject Conf. Have you seen any of the previews for those talks?
I don't think I have, although it's on a lot of topics that are sort of peripherally related. And I think a lot of them are I think most of them are very sort of open source community focused and co-presenting with other folks. But yeah, I think Adrian is during Rejects, and I don't think I'll quite be there yet because I think, landing late Sunday after, if you look at, wall clock time, it seems like it's just this incredibly long thing, travel time. But, with the time change and whatnot, it always just seems like a time distortion. But So yeah, I think I get there late Sunday. So I'll unfortunately miss the rejects talk. Yeah, and then there's talks like from I always call him Puerco, but Adolfo and Carlos and others have talks on things like S-bombs, which I love hearing Puerco talk about S-bombs because he's the go-to person on S-bombs. Certainly at Chainguard, a lot of folks come to him from the community and elsewhere to talk about them. So it's always interesting to get the latest from him because the SBOM space is also sort of an evolving thing as, folks are starting to wrap their heads around it and, form best practices around how you do X and how you do Y and how you actually consume those to do other useful things, which really informs how you produce it and what information you put in there. I think is heavily influenced by what you want to do with it and the use cases there, right? Do you want to do vulnerability scans or license compliance? Do you need things down to the file level, or do you want it at the package level or the image level? I mean, there's just so many things.
Right.
Does it have to be all encompassing, or can it reference other things, and so on and so forth? So it's always great to hear him talk about that stuff.
So if you had to choose one of the 5 talks to watch, which one would that be?
That's tough. So I'm going to miss Puerco's talk because I'm flying out early Friday. I generally am naughty. I like the hallway track so much. I often skip most talks because they're recorded. So that's sort of my non-answer. I don't know that I'll actually go. I may go and, support them, but generally I actually don't go to the talks at KubeCon. I meet with people and talk to the people while I'm there.
I actually hear that a lot. And I think many people do that, and especially since we haven't seen each other in person for years. In this case, I think the hallway track will be the most popular talk at this KubeCon. I think they may want to move it somehow, like somewhere where there's like lots of room, because I see a lot of people joining that talk. I'm really, really keen to see releasing Kubernetes less often, because I find that like almost like a controversial point, and more securely. I think that's going to be very interesting. But what I would recommend, especially since you're listening to this after KubeCon, is skimming all 5 talks when they come out, and then watch with intent the one that you like the most. That's what I'm going to do.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Raygun. They give software teams instant visibility into the quality and the performance of their software. And I'm here with John Daniel Trask, co-founder and CEO of Raygun. JD, talk to me about the joy a team feels when they're able to find and resolve an issue even before a customer has a chance to get upset or reach out to support about the issue. Talk to me about that.
Well, I find it pretty exciting to be able to hit it off early. So, and being able to tell people that you resolved something. So maybe they come through, and they do report an issue, and you can say, cool, well, we don't need to ask you for any more context. We've got all the details and we can have this fixed tomorrow. It turns an at-risk customer into an absolute raving advocate. So that's a huge win. And then the other thing that was a little bit embarrassing, we launched Raygun, but we had these other products and we instrumented them. And that's when we realized this less than 1% of our users would ever actually report a problem. And so you're sitting there thinking your software is actually not bad, and actually it's really, really bad. And that's hurting all of your conversion rates, business performance. These aren't really dev tools, they're actually business tools.
All right, if you want to see how this dev tool impacts the entire business, head to raygun.com to learn more and start your 14-day free trial. No credit card required. Join thousands of customer-centric software teams who use Raygun every single day to deliver flawless experiences to their customers. Again, raygun.com.
Okay, so I would like to switch very quickly topics a little bit, because you mentioned something which I was fascinated about. You mentioned about the Knative revision count in the Chainguard dev staging environment reaching 456. And I'm wondering, why is that important?
That's a good question. And, I kind of jinxed it because pretty much as soon as I posted that, This is just our staging environment where we roll out changes every time we commit. As soon as I posted that, someone made a change to our Terraform, which ended up cycling that cluster and it reset back to zero. Yeah, so one of the reasons that was interesting to me was really about sort of, to some extent, scale. So we create enough resources as you're sort of cranking up to that number, both in terms of Kubernetes services and other things, that if we hadn't done the work to do things like garbage collect old revisions and all kinds of other things on the Knative side, it would have fallen over long before that. And really not necessarily Knative falling over. It's like your Kubernetes cluster would have been like, no, you can't create more services. So, there's these resource quotas that most vendors put on clusters around how many of certain types of resource you can have, like pods and services and other things. And at least in contexts like GKE, that's generally something that they control that's proportional to the size of your control plane. And as your cluster gets bigger, they give you a bigger control plane and you can have more of those resources. And so we still are running on a relatively small cluster, but if we were to just be creating all those things and not sort of cleaning up behind it and stuff like that, we would have hit one of those limits by now and had a bad time. But like really, we reached that high number really just by continuing to do what we needed to do and not worrying about the infrastructure. And it just reached that point. And I was like, great, that's awesome.
Is this number 456 counting the updates to Knative? Is that what this number is? So you updated Knative 456 times in the staging environment.
Each Knative service, when you update it, so in Kubernetes, resources have a generation. Every time you change their spec, generation in the metadata section gets incremented by the API server automatically. And so basically what this number represents is how many times that's been bumped. So how many times have we actually pushed a new image? How many times have we, changed the configuration, whatnot, since the cluster effectively, came up? And bear in mind that like we're using tooling like KO, which does reproducible builds. So like the image doesn't change unless the code changes. So that's a fair amount of stuff that, has been rolling out over time where there's some meaningful change to those things. And I think there were two that were at 456. There were some that were lower either because they got introduced later or just haven't had code changes to them. So yeah, I mean, I think the fact that we stopped paying attention to the infrastructure for a while because it was just working and, it managed to crank along to that point was very exciting because, ultimately, I think that was one of the goals with Knative was to try and take all of those things that you need to worry about normally with Kubernetes to really build a production ready service with, okay, I've got my deployment, I've got my service, I've got my, L7 layer, whether that's Ingress or something like Istio virtual services. I've got my autoscaler. I've got, how am I doing TLS? Am I using, cert manager resources, right? And on and on and on. And even with those things, right, it's hard to do things like request-based scaling, certainly in a performant way, if you want to scale to zero. And so the fact that like we can write, really it's a tiny amount of YAML for each of the services we stand up. I mean, at one point I was like, it fits in a tweet, right? It's basically API version kind, metadata, and then the one bit that is a little tricky to remember, we wanted to align with what a lot of the Kubernetes apps resources look like. So it's spec, template, spec, containers, and then the pointer to your image. And that's literally all you need to stand up an HTTP service on Knative. So, and you get all of those things. You get auto scaling, and if you've configured auto TLS, you'll get a TLS terminated service with auto scaling and request-based auto scaling, and it does smart rollouts at default. Because we know it's HTTP serving, we can do things like default readiness probes, and like if your container's crash looping or your HTTP server's not coming up, we don't roll traffic over to those things. one of the sort of like really nuanced things that is just incredibly hard to get right in Kubernetes is really nailing the life cycle around readiness probes, draining traffic and accepting traffic. And, in particular, right, like there's sort of two classes of apps. There's apps that like ignore signals and they stick around for this, what's called the termination grace period, which is between the sig term and the sig kill, which luckily defaults to like 30 seconds. So it's not sitting around like forever. And then the other class of people are the people who, there's a third, which they do it properly, but that's like super niche. The second big category of people are like, okay, well, I'm gonna do signal handling. When I get sig term, I'm just gonna quit, right? And that's actually not what you want to do, right? You want to like handle sig term by starting to fail readiness probes, but all your normal requests will sort of be handled properly, because it takes time from when you start to fail readiness probes until your pod is marked not ready. That's the like failure threshold on the readiness probes. And then once your pod's marked not ready, right, that has to roll out to all of the network programming, right? So that has to, your pod's endpoint has to be removed from the endpoints on the API server. So the service controller has to see that your pod's not ready, remove it from endpoints. But like, you're not done there, right? Those endpoints then have to be propagated to, in vanilla Kubernetes, all of the nodes, which have to reprogram their IP tables. Or if you're in mesh mode, every single pod sidecar now needs to know that like, okay, that pod, that endpoint is no longer available, right? So in some cases, and it's some scales of clusters, I don't think that 30 seconds is even necessarily long enough. But the reason I bring it up is we did a whole bunch of magic in Knative, since we know it's an HTTP-based service, to make it so that it's really hard to get that wrong. Because it's really hard to get it right in vanilla Kubernetes, but it's actually really, really hard to get that wrong in Knative. So like one of the things we do is we have a pre-stop hook where we do something somewhat magical where the pre-stop hook is on one container, but the place to send it is on the other container. So we have a proxy that sits in front of the application container. And when Kubernetes is going to go stop the pod, instead of actually sending any signal to the user container, it sends it to our sidecar first. And our sidecar starts to fail probes and do it properly so that you don't have to, right? So if you're in the first camp of folks who, doesn't really handle the signaling at all and just continues to serve traffic normally, you will still drain properly because our, what we call the queue proxy, will actually handle that for you. And if you're in the second camp where you just do what I call a YOLO exit, you're like, I got the sig term, I'm out. You're still good as well, because since we have that pre-stop hook, we get the signal first, we make sure traffic is drained, and then by the time you're actually getting that signal, traffic's been routed away from that instance of your application. And so it's really, really hard actually within the context of Knative to handle that wrong. And I think that's a really important thing to get right if you're using any sort of auto-scaled application, because when you scale up, right, there's a window where the new pod's coming up, and if it reports ready before it's really ready, like, you're in trouble. You're going to serve 500s. And if, when you're scaling down, if traffic continues to go to those pods after they've started to shut down, you're going to get 500s, right? So the goal is 0 500s. And we have all kinds of tests in Knative where we're like, no, there should be 0 500s. The other thing that we do that is really hard is, and the networking layers make this incredibly hard to do, and we work around all kinds of stuff in basically every ingress provider, is ready means ready, right? Everyone at the networking level is like, yeah, it's eventually consistent. It'll get there at some point. But it's like, no, if we roll out a new revision, we want to know when we tell the user, like, yeah, you got your new code, that we're not lying, right? And so Knative does all of this fun stuff where we actually inject hashes of the network programming into the network configuration in ways that are our elements of the data path will respond with the header that's being injected by the network programming. And then the components we have can actually probe different things to understand what version of the network programming has been rolled out. And then once it's been rolled out everywhere, we can't do this in mesh mode because we can't probe mesh sidecars. But we do this for like probing the pool of envoys if you're running outside of mesh mode. So for instance, traffic serving off cluster, we can probe and make sure that like once we fully rolled things out and we say it's rolled out, you should never get the old version. It is at the new version because we've confirmed all the networking programming is there.
Listening to you unpack this, I have two things like on the top of my mind that I have to get them out there. The first thing is a Knative Ship It episode with you is long overdue. And I think that's what I'm picking from this. Like we really have to dive into Knative in a dedicated Ship It episode. That would be great. The second thing which I want to say, I think that it's time for your timeline cleanser for this conversation. And because people are listening to this and they don't know what it means, can you describe your timeline cleanser for us, please?
Do you mean Charlie?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Who is Charlie?
He's asleep under my desk here.
Okay, so Charlie, everyone listening, Charlie's a dog. Charlie's Matt's dog specifically, and he's super cute. And when after Matt talks too much technical stuff and Chainguard and Knative, he brings Charlie just to break the timeline. So that's amazing. Yeah. See, that's the picture. That's the screenshot we should have taken. Okay.
He's not thrilled that I woke him up.
How old is Charlie? I'm wondering.
Charlie's about a year and a half. So one of our previous dog passed early in the pandemic. She was getting really old and had all kinds of health problems, and so that was sad. She was like my shadow during the work from home, and so we were like, we're never getting another dog. It was too sad. And the house sort of felt empty. I mean, especially me working from home, right? Like, I was working from home when I was at VMware. And then, when I took my break, it was just like, I was never really home alone when I was working from home because she was always there and she'd follow me around the house. Although one of her health problems was she was deaf, so she wouldn't always follow me around because she didn't know I'd be wandering around if she was asleep. But so we actually got really lucky with Charlie, who's a great dog, because we started to talk to folks with this breed of puppy. We love this kind of dog. They're Cavalier King Charles Spaniels. They're fantastic dogs. We started to talk to them not because we necessarily wanted one right away, because we were still getting over Lily, but during the pandemic, everyone seemed to get a dog. So there was this really long waiting period. So we weren't telling our daughter that we were talking about this or anything. And then one of the folks that my wife had reached out to called her one time when she was in the car and it was on speakerphone. And she was like, well, I had, someone fall through who was going to take a puppy home like this weekend. And, would you be interested in meeting him? And so this is on like a Thursday. And so we went out and met Charlie on, I think it was going to be Saturday, but she had another litter of puppies. There were puppies all over her house. So we ended up meeting him on Sunday. He's quite a bit smaller. And it was fantastic, both because of him, but also because of sort of walk in, you sit on the floor and you get mobbed by puppies. It's a very therapeutic.
Special feeling, yes. Special feeling.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Matt. That's. I will make sure to put images, the ones that you share with me, in the show notes for people to see who Charlie is, and if you want one of Lily, I wouldn't mind including it. I think that would be nice.
Oh, sure.
This episode is brought to you by MongoDB, the makers of MongoDB Atlas, the multi-cloud application data platform. Atlas provides an integrated suite of data services centered around a cloud database designed for scale, speed, and simplicity. You can ditch the columns and the rows once and for all and switch to a database loved by millions for its flexible schema and query API. When you're ready to launch, Atlas layers on production-grade resilience, performance, and security so you can confidently scale your project from 0 to 1. Atlas is a truly multi-cloud database. Deploy your data across multiple regions simultaneously on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. Yes, you heard that right. Distribute your data across multiple cloud providers at the same time. The next step is to try Atlas free today. They have a free forever tier. Prove to yourself and your team that the platform has everything you need. Head to mongodb.com/changelog. Again, mongodb.com/changelog. And by Chronosphere. When it comes to observability, teams need a reliable, scalable, and efficient solution so they can know about issues well before their customers do. They need a solution that helps them move faster than the competition. And companies born in the cloud-native era often start with Prometheus for monitoring, which is obviously an amazing piece of software, but they quickly push it to its limits and often outgrow it. They run into issues with siloed data, missing long-term storage, and wasted engineering time firefighting the monitoring system versus delivering their application with confidence. They describe the system as a house of cards, where a single developer's seemingly benign change can overload the whole monitoring system, or they say they're flying blind because they pride themselves on making data-driven decisions, but losing visibility means they lose this competitive edge. Ryan Sokol, VP of Engineering at DoorDash, has this to say about Chronosphere, quote, "The visibility and control that Chronosphere's platform gives us to manage our observability data and costs are a game changer, especially with our unprecedented growth," end quote. Chronosphere is the observability platform for cloud-native teams operating at scale. Learn more and get a demo at chronosphere.io. Again, chronosphere.io.
I'm wondering about Chainguard, and I'll start with a big one, with a big why. Why does Chainguard do what it does?
That's a great question. Why is Chainguard doing what it does? Well, we're working on doing a lot of things. I think in terms of the space and focusing on the supply chain space in particular, is rooted in, it's, I think, one of the big problems facing our industry right now. The prevalence of attacks is just going up and up and up and up. Mm-hmm. And there's some point solutions for pieces of the problem, but it's still really hard to do this sort of holistically end to end from source all the way through to production. And, I think one of the difficulties there, right, is even if you do that for your own stuff, it's something like 90% of what folks ship to production these days isn't something that they built. It's something that they either got off the shelf in the form of system packages from, your, Debian Mirror or your, Alpine or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Or, and that's in your image, but like in your application itself, that's true as well, because, you are likely consuming either in Go, random, well, hopefully not completely random, right? Certain libraries to do what you want to do, right? Like if you're rendering PDFs, there's probably some library that you're using to do it. And you haven't, rolled your own, way of writing PDFs, right? Yeah. To pick just a completely random example. Or Java, you're likely using jars off of Maven Central, or, one of the ones that gets a lot of attention is NPM, right? Like NPM, it may even be more than 90% because people write these little one-liners and you pull in, enough node modules to fill your disk, right? So, just increasingly, it's become all about the package managers for really bootstrapping new languages. One of the funny things that I always felt like it was sort of missing from C++, I know there's things like Conan now, but I really had an aha moment the first time I used Maven. And I was like, oh, cool. There's this, repository of really useful libraries. And, I can, download things and use them. But, at the same time, right, like, how do you establish trust for those things and whatnot? So I think the point there, right, is there's a lot more to securing your supply chain than really just securing your own stuff. So that's one of the reasons I think we're so invested in open source as well, because ultimately we need to make this incredibly easy to use and incredibly accessible to open source developers. And so So one of the key projects that we are investing in and building around is a set of projects under an umbrella called Sigstore projects. The code names are, the project names are Fulcio, Recore, Cosign. So Cosign is the CLI. It's what I think folks will probably have the most exposure to in terms of, if they're a developer day to day, like they may invoke Cosign to attach what's called an SBOM, or to sign things, or to attest to things, which is a form of signing a claim. But I think one of the most exciting things for me about what Sigstore is doing is not the sort of traditional modes of signing in tools like Cosign, where you generate a public-private key pair or you use a KMS system. And then with those keys, you sign things, and then, it's verifiable with, the verification key. You can do those with Cosign, but I think what's really, really exciting to me, and I think ties into that, making it accessible to and easy for developers, is this thing called keyless signing. So if you sort of rewind time 10 or so years, maybe more now, I'm going to show my age, but before Let's Encrypt existed, right? Getting TLS certificates for your website was hard, it was expensive, and and then Let's Encrypt came along, right? And they got themselves registered as a certificate authority with, all the groups that sort of matter in the space to become a certificate authority. Then they offered this public good service that would go, it had a challenge process, and you could get TLS certificates. And there's fantastic graphs that sort of show where the number of websites with TLS before Let's Encrypt, and then it launched, and it goes up and up and up. And at this point, right, like when you're viewing a website and it doesn't have the little green lock in your browser or whatever, right, like it's very suspect, right? And some browsers, like I think this is standard in Chrome, won't even show websites if they, don't have TLS. It's certainly something you can turn on. I mean, new top level domains like .dev for sure basically require TLS in order to serve HTTP on them. So the reason I bring it up is we like to make this analogy when we're explaining Sigstore, since Let's Encrypt is a fairly well-established thing nowadays that many folks use for TLS, where one of the objectives of the Sigstore community is, and they're working really hard towards a GA of this public good infrastructure, is something like that, which instead of being a certificate authority for web traffic, it's a certificate authority for signing. And so it's this really cool process where if you enable this mode of keyless signing and you use Cosign, you say, Cosign sign my OCI image digest, it will send you through what I've been calling an identity challenge. So it pops open your browser, and you go through a 3LO, a web single sign-on OAuth flow with, it gives you a couple choices on the public good instance. You can use GitHub or Google, or I think there's support for a form of Microsoft identity in there as well. And then once this identity challenge is complete, it'll sign your image and route that into this public good instances sort of certificate authority, and folks can verify things. And so what's happening behind the scenes there, we call this keyless, and it's like serverless. There's still servers and serverless. But what happens is it's keyless in the sense that, like, you don't have to manage or think about keys. The keys are sort of, ephemeral, and they exist for as long as you need them to exist, and then they're gone. So in keyless signing, what happens is Cosign generates a key pair in memory, and then it goes through this identity challenge, and there's a few other elements to the challenge process, like proving you actually have the private key to this Fulcio certificate authority. And a few things happen, right? One is that challenge process completes, but then you get back a certificate that basically says, okay, like I've verified that this is the identity that I provisioned this certificate for. And so if you were to Cosign verify, which is the dual to signing, something that's been keyless signed, what you'll see is encoded into the certificate, and you can do this the hard way with things like OpenSSL and stuff too. What you'll see is something like Matt Moore at Chainguard, is encoded into the certificate. And so when full CO is basically taking your key pair and actually rooting it into the certificate chain, it includes the identity that the challenge process worked for. And so since if I'm doing the human version of this and using single sign-on to prove my identity, that gets included into the certificate. I think it's in the subject of the certificate. There's two forms of it where we either use a URI if you're using something like Spiffy identity or something like that. But if there's an email-based identity, like, if you're to sign on with Google, or, the GitHub identity can produce an email too, then it'll be included into the email section of the certificate. And then you can also start to include more and more information into some of the certificate extensions as well. So, I mentioned the human flow, right? There's also a sort of workload flow. And so this is one of the really cool things about. So I've become such a nerd about OIDC, in particular, the prospects that it enables with things like federation and having a form of portable auth. But so many things have started to adopt this as a standard, right? You can produce identity tokens from, most Google identities. So like GKE workload identity produces an OIDC compatible token. But Kubernetes itself has support for through what's called, I never remember the order of the soup here, but it's service account projected volume tokens, where you can, for the service account that your workload is running as, you can project a token with a particular audience and the lifespan's configurable. I don't think it can be lower than 10 minutes, but you can adjust it. And so what's cool here is a lot of the major vendors, GKE does this by default, EKS, I think, does it by default, or it's, at least one of the standard ways of spinning up EKS clusters. And AKS now has this in preview, where the issuer for your cluster is world visible, which means you can send those tokens to services, and those services can actually verify those tokens because they can hit your issuer and get the verification keys for those verifying the signature on the OIDC tokens. And then you can do what's called federation, where federation is a process where you take the OIDC token and you basically send it to something like Google or Amazon. Both of them have a service they call STS, or the security token service, where you can exchange a third-party token for a token that's first party. So it's now a Google token or an Amazon token, and then you can do things with them. And that's super, super, super cool, especially since Google and Amazon don't need to know about, who you are, right? Anyone with an identity provider that's, does OIDC can potentially integrate with these things and do federation, which is super, super cool. So the workload-based signing basically builds around this. So the public good instance has a set of issuers that are sort of well-established that it can accept tokens from. And then as workloads, you can sign these things. And so GitHub recently launched support for identity tokens. And so as part of GitHub Actions, right, when I'm producing things, I can now do keyless signing just by adding to my workload. I think you need permissions, ID token, write, which allows you to produce these things. And then you just say cosign, sign, image name, and it works like magic.
Sorry to jump in, Matt. I mean, it's fascinating what you're telling me. I wish I could listen to you for at least another hour, but I know that we're hitting against your time limit. There's a bunch of things which I wanted to ask you or we didn't get to. So this is what I think we should do, and it's a proposal. I think that we need to have Kim on to talk about Enforce, because we haven't even cracked open that subject. And when I talked to Puerco last time in the previous episode, he was saying I haven't even mentioned this thing. That's okay. Matt will come on and we'll talk with Matt about Enforce. And that hasn't happened. And that's okay. It's not a problem. I was very curious to start unpacking with you, how can the CI/CD ecosystem help? What are the changes that needs to happen there so that they help the supply chain? But I don't think we have time for that. We have time for one more question. And this is something I know that our audience really appreciates, and that is the key takeaway. So from all this conversation, I'm just very aware of all the things that we haven't hit, because like we could talk for hours and hours, and like you have like so much information in that head of yours. I don't know where it fits, but
me neither. It falls out my ears when I don't have them corked.
That's a good one. So when it comes to the key takeaway from our conversation for the listeners that stuck with us all the way to the end, what would you say that would be?
That's a great question. I would say signing is the beginning. It's not the end goal. And I think that it would behoove most organizations to start looking at how you start signing things now, because it's really a foundational thing. Mm-hmm. And if you can get to the point where you have that foundation, you can then start to do really interesting things with that, right? Both, you sign things like provenance to say, like, I produce this. So think signed commits. But it goes so far beyond that once you start to talk about things like attestations and all the other kinds of useful pieces of metadata you might sign with. And I think, to touch on and to tease Enforce a little bit, Enforce is really about sort of the complementary side of signing, right? Which is, I've now signed all my stuff. Why did I do that, right? And it's so you can actually have policy around the types of signatures you want to allow into different contexts and things like that. Mm-hmm. Now that you really signing is sort of like a form of authentication. You're saying, this is my identity, since now we have that identity element to this, right? And I am making some sort of statement about this thing that I have signed, right? So now what identities do you trust in what context to say what things, right? So these are the kinds of things where policy gets involved, and where you can actually start to leverage that metadata that we're trying to make incredibly easy to attach to actually then make judgment calls about these things. So yeah.
That's a great one. So I think what I'm going to do is cancel a few meetings that I had planned for KubeCon, so I have more time to talk to you, because I can see where this is going. I would love to have you back sometime soon so we can continue this conversation. We have a bit more time. I think there's a lot to unpack here. It's super important. It's going to affect us all. And I think the people that are not paying attention, that's okay. You will have a wake-up call at some point. But this stuff is really important. I'm pretty sure it is. And I think we need to keep driving this home. It will take a whole town. I know it's a cliche, but that's exactly what it will take. It will take all of us to improve the supply chain of our software. Delaying it will only make it more urgent, and then we'll be like headless chickens running around. That's okay. It works for some, but I would like to get ahead of the game if we can. And I can definitely see where this is going. Matt, thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to meeting you at KubeCon. Please bring all the swag, because I'll be there. And I'll get a bag just for that. And I'm looking forward to talking to you next time. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Ship It. Check out our other podcasts for developers at changelog.com/master. You can connect with like-minded developers from all over the world via changelog.com/community. Thank you, Fastly, for the worldwide low-latency changelog.com. Our listeners love those blazing fast MP3s. Your beats are awesome, Breakmaster Cylinder. That's it for this week. See you all next week. My last thought for today is your Ship It feedback. If you enjoy the show, rate us on your favorite podcasting platform. You can be the first listener that leaves us feedback on Apple Podcasts. I'm looking forward to it.